Just when it feels like the fantasy football season couldn't beat you up anymore, we have 6 teams on bye in week 12. Now the waiver wire, it's starting to look pretty thin, but let's dive in and see if there's any players that can help you in week 12. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today, where we dive into week 12 of fantasy football. Now in today's show, we're going to be talking about some of the top injuries from last week in week 11, 5 things we learned from last week, what teams are on upcoming bye here in week 12, and then we'll dive into the waiver wire and see if there is anything out there that could possibly help us. Now before we dive into the first section here of top injuries from last weekend, I do want to take a quick second to thank the community. I have received a ton of messages with thoughts and prayers from people all throughout Headliner Nation praying for my family. Now, I cannot tell you how much that means to me, and it's helping me get through this time. Just like all of you, we're all dealing with things in life, and sometimes life sucks. But we're gonna do what we always do. We're gonna try to make the best out of a bad situation. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and get into a bunch of details, but I will say this: please continue to keep my family in your prayers. They are very, very much appreciated at this time. But before I start getting emotional on camera, let's go ahead and start talking about some of the top injuries from just this past weekend. Not a lot of bad injuries, which is a good thing for sure, but we did have some that we want to bring up. How about Alexander Madison dealing with an ankle injury? Both him and Zamir White are dealing with injuries right now that could cause them to miss some time. What's going to happen in the backfield of Las Vegas? We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. How about Darnell Mooney? He suffered a hamstring injury, but now they're on an upcoming bye week. He's definitely somebody to pay attention to, but word is already coming out that this is not a serious injury. Hopefully we can have him after the bye or shortly thereafter. And then Tajay Spears. He's in the concussion protocol, and that could give us another full week of Tony Pollard usage. Now, with 6 teams on bye this week, I am very grateful to the fact that only 3 players are right here in this section of the video. It could have been a lot worse for a lot of teams. So now let's move on to 5 things that we learned just last week in fantasy football. The first thing being, sometimes the right pick just doesn't work out in fantasy. You would not believe how many comments we get every single week after the games have been played that says, "Man, you had TJ Hawkinson ranked so highly and he sucked. I could have started Will Dissly." I mean, come on. Studs are gonna have bad games. It's real easy to see who you should have started after the games are already over, but we gotta play the odds. We gotta play the guys who more often than not produce. We lock those guys into our lineup, we make those picks, and we live with the outcomes. That right there is what makes fantasy football fun. Because if we all always had the answers to the test every single week, this game would get so damn boring and repetitive. But what else did we learn? How about that Justin Herbert may be a late season hero in fantasy football? 19 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games, has had at least 49 yards rushing or a rushing touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games played, and he has one of the easiest rest of season schedules at the quarterback position. We know that Los Angeles needs to keep winning ball games, and now he's going to get a pretty good matchup this week. We'll talk about him here in a minute. How about Taysom Hill may be locked into your lineups rest of season? Now, if you don't have one of the top couple tight ends, this dude needs to be a weekly lock in your lineup. Obviously, this week they're on bye. We'll talk about that in a minute. But outside of that, dude probably needs to be in your tight end spot if you don't have one of the top studs. Sure, he's going to bust sometimes, but all tight ends bust sometime in fantasy football. His ceiling, though, is matchup winning, and most tight ends don't have that type of ceiling. Now, speaking of that, how about a quarterback? How about that Anthony Richardson is the Taysom Hill of the quarterback position? You never know what you're going to get. He can look great. He can look bad. He can get benched. He can get hurt. But then he has a good game and he can be matchup winning for your fantasy team. I mean, look at just last week. He would have barely been a top 20 overall quarterback if he was not saved by 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, sure, he could definitely find the end zone weekly, but having to rely on multiple rushing touchdowns to finish highly, that's where a lot of the risk comes into play. He really becomes one of those players in fantasy football that you kind of just live with whatever happens. You're going to start him knowing that you could get 4 points, you could get 34 points, and really not a whole lot in between. But if you ever find yourself behind and you got to try to find that high upside risky play, Anthony Richardson could be that rest of season. Now that they've said it's going to be his job, again, for the foreseeable future. And then lastly, how about Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp absolutely killing the fantasy value of Kyren Williams, the dude who was Mr. Consistent in finding the end zone almost every single week, now doesn't have a touchdown in 3 straight ball games. He's only gone over 100 total yards one time in his last 5 games, and now he just had a game last week where he had 0 targets. No passing work is absolutely going to suck if we can't find consistent touchdowns. We really talked about this all off season long. It's why I had some concerns about Kyren Williams. They just didn't come to fruition earlier in the season because we lost Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. But now that we're back, we're seeing a little bit more of that lower ceiling from Kyren Williams, and it absolutely sucks. Worst time of the year for it to happen. But what about bye weeks? I mentioned earlier that we have 6 teams on bye this week. We have the Atlanta Falcons, so no Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Kyle Pitts. How about no Buffalo this week? No Josh Allen, James Cook, Khalil Shakir, Amari Cooper. No Cincinnati, so no Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Chase Brown, T. Higgins. They're not going to be available for you here this week. New Orleans, no Alvin Kamara, no Taysom Hill, not even an MVS for your lineup here this week. The Jets, no Aaron Rodgers, no Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams. How about no Jacksonville? Really, it's just Brian Thomas Jr. and Evan Ingram, but you can see that we are without a ton of fantasy viable options here in week 12. And really, that tells me that there are going to be a lot of teams out there that if they're dealing with injuries on their benches as well, they're going to need to look to the waiver wire here this week to try to fill a hole. Now, the waiver wire isn't exploding with options right now by any means, but there are a few names. So let's go ahead and dive into the quarterback position first. And the quarterback position is really where we have the most high-end options available, kind of like we have most of the season. First up, I'm mentioning Justin Herbert. Now, he's currently 78% owned, so he's not going to be available in a lot of leagues, but if you need a quarterback, just go out there and look just to be safe. He's going up against Baltimore here this week. And like I mentioned earlier in the show, he's got 19 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games. He's starting to run the ball with a lot of success in this offense. He has one of the easiest rest of season schedules at the quarterback position. And like I said also, LA needs to keep winning ball games in this division. And now a matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position on the year. So if you need one, if he's out there, great option. Another guy, Bo Nix. How the hell is Bo Nix only 58% owned still? I've been talking about this guy for like over a month on this show, and people just say, I don't need Bo Nix. Why? He's the current quarterback 7 overall on the season, and through 11 weeks of this year, there isn't anyone out there on earth that would have expected him to score more points than Brock Purdy, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff, Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love, or CJ Stroud. Now, he just played Las Vegas back in week 5, and he was the quarterback 8 overall on the week. We've seen him continue to put up good points weekly in that matchup this week once again against Las Vegas. If he's out there and you need a quarterback, for the love of all things holy, pick up Bo Nix. How about Matthew Stafford? He's going up against Philadelphia. He's 53% owned right now, and I have no idea what that was in week 10, but he definitely bounced back in week 11. He has 10 touchdowns over his last 4 games played, and he's going to have to try to find a way once again to move the ball through the air against this Philadelphia defense, who is much more difficult to run on than throw on. Now, when you have guys like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, that always helps. How about Geno Smith? He's 57% owned going up against Arizona. And I said last week that Geno was going to have to throw the ball with some success in order to beat San Francisco. And that's what they did. DK Metcalf is back. JSN Jackson Smith-Njigba is looking great. And the Seattle Seahawks are fighting for the division and will continue to do that down the stretch. Now, the biggest question here is what Arizona team shows up after their bye. They were hot before the bye, and if they can come out hot once again, this won't be a cakewalk for Geno, but he's got a lot of options at his disposal. How about Anthony Richardson? He's 43% owned going up against Detroit. So now he gets his job back, and he comes out and beats the Jets. But we all know, at this point, no one, unless you're living under a rock, you understand that he's just a weekly boom or bust type guy. He is going to require rushing touchdowns every week to have a ceiling type game. He had 2 rushing touchdowns last week in week 11. Had he not gotten those, he's barely a top 20 option once again. But now they're going up against Detroit, and they're a top 5 overall running defense in the NFL. Now, if you're swinging for the fences, that's when Anthony Richardson becomes an opportunity. Now, after him, we go down to Jameis Winston of the Cleveland Browns. He's currently 17% owned going up against Pittsburgh, and it's crazy to see him come out and throw the ball for 395 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions, and still get absolutely railroaded by the New Orleans Saints, 35-14. We know that Jameis Winston has the weapons to go out there and throw for big yardage and touchdowns every single week, but this one may be the toughest matchup he's had yet going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And then lastly, how about Drew Lock of the New York Giants? He's only 3% owned. He's probably out there in most leagues. He's going up against Tampa Bay, and he's coming off the bye week and getting a chance to start. Daniel Jones is starting on the bench post-bye for the New York Giants. And this is a great opportunity for Drew Lock to go out there and find some success against Tampa Bay because they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Now, I really expect Drew Lock to go out there and lock on to the likes of Malik Neighbors. He needs to try to provide a spark in this offense to try and keep this starting job longer than just 1 week. Is he a safe start? No, absolutely he's not a safe start. It's still a risky pick, but if you're in a deeper league and just need a quarterback, Drew Lock has a great opportunity in week 12. Now, before we dive into the running back position, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek. And I'm hoping by now that everyone out there knows all about SeatGeek, the #1 rated ticketing app. They have tickets for over 70,000 events right now. It's concerts, it's sporting events, it's festivals, and so much more. And they take tickets from all across the internet, put them in one place so you can ensure that you're getting the best deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10. You gotta look for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad. But you know I wouldn't be talking about it if I wasn't able to give you an additional discount, so you can use the promo code HEADLINERS there on SeatGeek to get $20 off. The holiday season is right around the corner. Don't just go out there and buy a present that someone's gonna forget about a few months down the road. Go out there and get some tickets to an event that you and a loved one or a friend want to go to, because I can guarantee you the experience that you get going to the event is going to last a lot longer in your memory than whatever that present that you're wrapped under the tree. So once again, that's $20 off your first purchase using the promo code HEADLINERS over on SeatGeek. There's links down below in the description. All right, back to the waiver wire. Let's dive into some running backs. And when we do that, we see there's not a ton of options out there on the waiver wire at this position right now. We got Cam Akers up first, the Minnesota Vikings. He's 23% owned going up against Chicago. Now, he's had at least 12 touches now in back-to-back ball games, but he continues to average his normal sub 3 yards per carry. But this is a high-powered Minnesota offense, and that could produce some touchdown chances for Cam Akers, being that he's splitting touches right now with Aaron Jones. Not a great matchup going up against Chicago, but the touchdown opportunities are always there. How about Amir Abdullah of the Las Vegas Raiders going up against Denver? He's only 1% owned right now, and really this is process of elimination. There's not much else left in Las Vegas right now. Zamir White and Alexander Mattison are both dealing with injuries that could cost them some missed time. We know that Amir Abdullah is a great pass-catching option out of the backfield and possesses a lot of speed in this offense. In a matchup coming up this week going up against Denver where it may be easier to run on them than throw on them, I'm talking deep leagues, Amir Abdullah could have some value. How about Kenneth Gainwell of the Philadelphia Eagles, only 4% owned going up against the Los Angeles Rams? And everyone knows that this is Saquon Barkley's backfield. I'm not saying that Kenneth Gainwell is coming in there and carving out a huge role, but he is getting a few more opportunities each and every week. He's really more of a handcuff to Saquon Barkley, but being that he plays in a high-powered scoring offense, he could be another one of those guys that just has a possible touchdown opportunity each week. And then lastly, Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears, 14% owned. They're going up against Minnesota. Not an easy matchup whatsoever. But what we did see last week is the new offensive coordinator in Chicago still wants to run the football a lot. Roschon Johnson had over 10 touches for the first time since week 1 just last week. He remains a goal line option in this offense, and the Bears just scored their most points in a game since week 5. Now, he's not overtaking DeAndre Swift by any means, but if he can be hovering right around 10 touches a week, week. In a week like this with so many injuries and bye weeks, he could be a low-end flex option. But now we'll transition over to the wide receiver position. There's a few more options out there. How about guys like Juwan Jennings in San Francisco? He's 75% owned, but I have no idea why he's not almost 100% owned. If he's out there in your league, grab him. I understand a lot of leagues he's not going to be sitting out there, but if he is, grab him and stash him on the bottom of your bench. He could come in clutch late in the season. He's had back-to-back games with 11 targets, and I don't see that volume going anywhere rest of season. How about MVS, Marquez Valdez-Scantling? He's 35% owned, but he's on a bye week this week, and I talked about him last week, and I do not care that he is on a bye week this week. If you need a wide receiver for the stretch run to try to make it to the fantasy playoffs, MVS is a solid bench stash as of right now. He has a catch of at least 67 yards or more in back-to-back games. So really, that tells me all he needs is one big one a week. So he may not be some safe weekly starter, but if you're in a pinch at any time late in the season, that guy can help you win your matchup and really only needs one catch to do it. How about Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders? He's 20% owned, and he's going up against Dallas. And Washington overall had a bad game last week against Philadelphia. I mean, Jaden Daniels just couldn't get the ball down the field at all, but this is a much better matchup for them going up against Dallas here this week, and this is somewhat of a quote-unquote revenge game. Noah Brown going back up against Dallas. We've seen him really be the number 2 option in the passing game here for the Washington Commanders for the last few weeks. I'm not going to look at just one bad game and say the guy is absolutely worthless. I'm still looking at him on the waiver wire if he's out there. How about Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers? He's 58% owned, going up against Baltimore here this week. Just had a season high in targets with 8, but was only able to bring in 2 of them. He's really that deep threat in this offense, and that's going to lead to some inconsistencies. But in a matchup going up against Baltimore, they're going to have to throw the ball. It's way easier to throw on Baltimore than it is to run on Baltimore, so Quentin Johnston could get those touchdown opportunities in Week 12. How about Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore? 2 guys in Cleveland going up against Pittsburgh. And the running game in Cleveland right now just sucks nuts. They're going to have to throw the ball a ton each and every week with Jameis Winston. Now, Jerry Jeudy, he has 3 straight games with at least 8 targets, and in PPR formats, he's a solid low-end flex if needed. Can we go out there and expect what we saw last week with 142 yards and a touchdown? No, absolutely not. But I can say a lot of the same things for Elijah Moore. 8+ targets in 3 straight games, 10+ fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. Another guy that is not some weekly must-start guy, but a solid lower-end flex play in PPR formats if that's what you need. Which will then take us through wide receivers. Let's pull up some tight ends now. How about Taysom Hill? Now, he's 48% owned, and yes, he's on a bye. I'm aware of that as well, but I've talked about this guy for weeks, and I'm going to continue to do that until he's over 70% owned, because I don't care that he's on a bye week. The tight end position every single week is a total wing and a prayer anyway. I might as well roll with a guy that can win you your matchup all by himself. Now, speaking of winning you your matchup, if you started Jonnu Smith last week, he may have helped you win your matchup as well, his best game of the season. Now he's going up against New England this week. He's currently 51% owned, and it's just another guy that we've talked about for quite some time. He's just a part of an offense that's going to go out there and give you a chance at fantasy points every single week. He's had at least 6 targets in 5 of his last 6 games, and like I just mentioned, he's coming off his best game of the year, had 5 catches for 62 yards already against New England earlier in the season as well. How about Zach Ertz? He's 46% owned going up against Dallas, and really he was the only dude in the Washington offense, at least in the passing game, that did anything last week. He's had at least 7 targets in 3 of his last 4 games, and now a solid matchup going up against Dallas. And then lastly, Will Dissly, only 19% owned going up against Baltimore, and he has really developed into a role player here in this offense. Another guy who's had at least 6 targets in 4 of his last 5 games, and now in a decent matchup going up against Baltimore, where LA is going to have to throw the ball to try to win this game, Will Dissly becomes an option once again in Week 12. Which means all we have left to talk about are a couple streaming defenses if you need it. How about the Washington Commanders? They're 29% owned as of right now, and they're going up against Dallas. Now, this defense in from Washington has been playing so much better here as of late. They've just been running into some super tough offenses. But now they get a matchup going up against Dallas, who is blinded by the sun, and Washington really needs to win this ball game. But we can also look at Miami this week if needed. They're 53% owned going up against New England, and New England isn't some juggernaut offense, and the Miami defense has been playing a little bit better here as of late as well. They held New England to 10 points back in week 5. So if you're needing another streaming defense, the Dolphins aren't a bad option either. But that'll get us through the waiver wire, and this is typically the part of the show where I give you guys some names of some players that you can go ahead and drop. But with all the injuries and all the bye weeks this week, we gotta be a little bit more careful. That's why, once again, I'm gonna ask you to leave a comment down below if you have a question on who you should drop from your team. Just let me know who it is you're thinking about dropping and who it is you're thinking about picking up. I can then try to help you figure out whether that's a good choice for your team or not. But that's gonna go ahead and wrap up the waiver wire show here for week 12. If you enjoyed it, do me a favor by hitting the like button if you haven't already. Now, I wish you all nothing but the best here for week 12. Good luck. It's gonna be a tough couple of weeks here as we get through Thanksgiving. But that right there is where we make our championship run. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.